I am Dr. Amy Salerno. I'm also known as Doctora Latina. Now, in general, we need to sort of define what is drowning. And really, drowning is a process of what we call in science and medicine asphyxiation, which really is the concept that there is a lack of flow of oxygen because of either a mechanical obstruction, like water blocking the airways, or asphyxiation can also be caused, for instance, in strangulation or in compression from an outside force. But right now we're talking about drowning, and in general that is a result of an inability for the body to continue passing oxygen from outside the body through the bronchi tubes, bronchioles, and down to the alveoli, and through a physiologic process and through the blood and the air passages. It's all very complex. That is how we get air to our body, to our brain, to our vital organs. Now, one thing that is really important that we talked about actually on a live that I was on a couple of nights ago is the fact that breathing in general is a reflex. It is an automatic process that is run by the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system. So when we breathe, we're not saying, I need to take a breath. I need to take a breath. It's an automatic process called respiration, breathing. And it is really what we call a reflex phenomenon. An important aspect of a victim of drowning is the initial reflex that happens when a person unwittingly or unexpectedly is submerged in water, especially water that is under 77 degrees Fahrenheit, because water under that temperature is considered, quote unquote, in the medical literature and autopsy literature, cool water. Okay? Whether it's salt water or whether it's lake water, the temperature under 77 degrees is considered cool water, especially when it's cold water. So you're getting down into the 40s, right, for cold water. But even if you're into 70s, 60s, and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that cool water, those temperatures, when a person unwittingly is submerged in water, if they are alive prior to being submerged, they have a gasp reflex, which is part of breathing, but it's related to the sudden immersion in cold or cool water. So I'm going to give you an example. The person is submerged, they do that, and there's an initial gasp. Okay? In that initial gasp, two things can happen. One is aspiration of lake or seawater. In addition, aspiration of the contents, dirt, silt, bacteria, and the like, from the contents of the surrounding water. And when that happens, very often in a process of drowning, a victim gasps and then they go into what we call laryngospasm. Laryngospasm meaning that the larynx, or the vocal cords, which are approximately at this level in the body, in the tracheobronchial tree, will spasm and shut. So you get an initial aspiration of fluid from the outside environs, laryngospasm. And from there, sometimes people don't recover from that laryngospasm, but the contents that they have aspirated on autopsy can be shown, and the physiologic reactions that occur from asphyxia and anoxia, lack of oxygen, will result in bloody tinged, for example, bloody tinged foam. And in a drowning victim, one of the 7, I'm going to call them little star points of the constellation of findings in drowning is blood-tinged foam. In the majority of cases, when blood-tinged foam from drowning is found on autopsy, it is found below the vocal cords. So from here down into the main stem bronchus, into the bronchial trees, into the bronchioles, which are tiny, tiny, and at the ends of your lungs, the alveoli. So when you find foam or blood-tinged foam on autopsy in a drowning victim, you're looking for foam blood-tinged below the point of bronchospasm. So that would be point number 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to comment on every specific point of Kiely's autopsy. I don't want to really have to spoon feed you. And I know from all the comments that I've gotten, the tremendous sophistication of the audience following me specifically, but also in the true crime community. You guys can look at the documents and you can go through. So I'm going to say I'm going to enumerate them. Number 1, was there blood-tinged foam found below the point of the vocal cords? If there was blood-tinged foam, that would count as a sort of point towards the possibility of a cause of death from drowning. Or do you find foam in the upper airway? And if so, or if you find no foam in the upper airway, that's going to point away from drowning. Now, interestingly, the other piece that we want to look at in terms of the lungs is the bogginess of the lungs. And yes, it does depend whether a person has been submerged in fresh water, like a lake water, river water, or salinated water. Salinated meaning salty water, like the ocean. If an individual is submerged in fresh water, the rate of decomposition, especially in cool water, not in tropical water, even if it's freshwater tropical, but in cool water, in a non-salinated or lake-type freshwater situation, the decomposition rate is going to be slower than in salty water. And that is for a variety of reasons, including the size of predators that can take attack, so to speak, at a body or a human being, right? It can also be according to different physiologic processes that occur in the decomposition process, but also in the drowning process. Now, I'm just going to give you an average in lake water. Generally, on autopsy, we combine the right and the left lung weights in grams, and what we do is we we look at averages. And so the average weight of a person who's drowned in lake water, and of course it depends on the measure and the level of decomposition, but the average drowning victim has a combined right and left lung weight of 1,300 grams, plus or minus about 400 grams. So the combined weights that you would be looking for as one of your constellation points would be, does this victim have a combined right and left lung weight of about 900 to about 1,700 grams? So go back and see what was, in the case of Kiely Rodni, the combined right and left lung, the summation of those weights. They were not near 1,300 grams. And in salt, then that would be in lake water, freshwater drownings. In salt water, it's actually quite a bit more. Okay. There are other findings on autopsy to do with the bogginess of the lungs. It's much more detailed, but where the lungs, when pressed just even with the fingers of the examiner, the gloved fingers of the examiner, the lungs often, because they're so boggy, will bring forth spurts of foam and water. Okay, was that something that was found on autopsy for this particular individual that we're discussing? There are other more particularly specific findings on the lungs proper. One is known as, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Paltoff's or Poltoff's spots on the surface of the lungs that are particular blood vessel tiny findings that you can see with the naked eye that are the result of the physiologic process of drowning, and they are found on the lung surfaces. So were very microscopic punctate, we say punctate like points, called Poltoff's spots. Was that noted on this particular autopsy? So far I've given you probably 2 or 3 of the findings in the diagnosis or the cause of death of drowning, okay? And now I'm just going to go through a few more, and that are very important and that have been discussed on many live shows and live chats that I've noticed recently. And that is, what are the findings in terms of gastric or stomach contents? So generally, one can find, as part of the process, even after laryngospasm, one can find a regurgitation of gastric contents and gastric fluids. So in the case of Kiely Rodni, as I recall, there were some particulate matter, small amounts of particulate matter of, I think, legumes and peas in the stomach contents found on autopsy. There was some liquid matter, but there were no particulate matter found, like legumes and peas, in the mouth area. So the presumption was that the liquid that was found in the mouth may indeed represent gastric contents, although of note there were no food particulate matters found in the mouth area on her autopsy. Very important, we also discussed briefly last time that there are both macroscopic, meaning you can see it with your eyes, gross findings, gross meaning you can see it grossly, and microscopic findings. And in drowning, indeed, histological or tissue can be prepped and looked under the microscope. Particularly, we look at the alveoli, which are the very tiny endpoint little airway sacs at the distant portions of the lung. And if those are looked under microscope, there are findings that can be seen with drownings. So that would be another one of the constellation points. The question back to you is, go look and see, were histologic, microscopic evaluations of the alveoli done and documented on this autopsy? Because in the list that I'm giving you, that is an important point. May or may not find on a victim of drowning microscopic changes in the alveoli that are particular to folks who may have drowned. The other really interesting finding, and this is also done on, it's actually done on gross examination of bodies of deceased, or of the decedent of deceased bodies, is to look again at the mastoid airway in the bone. There are air cells, pockets, and in the middle ear, the petrous. And there are, with not a microscope, but with your naked eye, if evaluated, the mastoid air cells and the petrous in the middle ear can have, and this is about something like 70% or more of drowning victims have in their mastoid air cells and in the petrous, they have hemorrhages that are a result of the different pressures and the different physiologic processes that happen in drowning. And so that actually, of all the findings, other than the CAT scan finding in the sphenoid sinus that I'm going to talk about, the hemorrhaging in the mastoid air cells and in the petrous, in the middle ear bone, those hemorrhages are extremely common, very common. Up to something like 70% of drowning victims have those. Unfortunately, on autopsy, probably close to 70% of victims the medical examiner doesn't actually look there. So, but when it is looked at, those folks that have drowned, 70% have those hemorrhaging in the mastoid bone, in those air cells that back there, and in the middle ear petrous bone. So that's extremely important. And the question is there commentary on the mastoid bone? Is there commentary on the petrous bone in Kiely's autopsy? We're getting towards the end here. One thing that is very often found in drowning victims, and it used to be thought, oh, this is pathognomonic, or this is the gotcha thing for drowning, and that is the pink, bright pink, that is noticed in the gum area and the staining of the teeth, bright pink, in drowning victims. But in the recent literature, what has begun to be understood in terms of why do people who drown often have the pink, bright pink gums and the bright pink teeth staining, it's actually not because a physiologic reaction from drowning, but actually it's a lividity. It is lividity. It is blood that is there, and it's a result of positional changes that the head has made during a period of time after submersion that causes the bright pink gums and teeth staining. If a person has that, it's thought maybe they drowned, but it's, again, not a gotcha, eureka, pathognomonic finding of drowning. Really, I think everything that I've mentioned are the top findings that we look for to make the presumptive diagnosis of accidental drowning. And all of the things that I have mentioned, whether it's foam below the vocal cords, gastric contents, in looking microscopically or even on gross examination of the tracheobronchial tree below the vocal cords, do we see dirt? Do we see silt? Do we even see aspiration of gastric contents that go into the lungs below the vocal cords? It's very important to look at that. And sometimes they can even look at what microbes or bacteria are in the lungs that are growing that would be consistent with, for example, freshwater lake water that the person is found in. So again, go back to the autopsy. Is there any commentary in looking at the tracheobronchial trees? Are they patent, meaning totally clear, no foam, no liquid, no gastric contents in the respiratory tree, no particulate matter like dirt, silt, could even be, if it were in the ocean, little pieces of seaweed, etc. So go back and look. If it was totally patent and there's none of the findings that I've just mentioned, that would point away from drowning. Finally, I want to talk about the concept of virtual autopsy. When I say virtual, that is a medical concept that has been coined, the term virtual meaning that it is not in vivo, where the medical examiner is actually hands-on looking either macroscopically, grossly at the body, or microscopically at tissue of the decedent, but rather virtually, and that virtually is done via CAT scan. In drowning victims, yes, generally it is a head-to-toe CAT scan, and they're looking for many different things, but in particular, for a drowning victim, the virtual CAT scan is looking at the sphenoid sinuses, which is the sinus in the nose area. You've got your maxillary, frontal sinuses, maxillary, sphenoid sinuses. Those are the major ones. And the sphenoid sinus, almost pathognomically, by virtual CAT scan. This is why this virtual CAT scan or virtual autopsy CAT scan is becoming so much more commonplace. You find fluid levels, water, within the sphenoid sinus proper. And really the only way to evaluate for that is by CAT scan. And so my question would be, was a CAT scan done? And if so, what did the sphenoid sinus look like on Kiely? Was there liquid in the sphenoid sinus? Now, a lot of people have commented like, oh, well, these are sort of pie in the sky things like a virtual autopsy with CAT scan. And I would respond by saying actually more and more that is being done. And especially in high profile cases, so that, there is a variety, or there are a variety of methods of coming to the presumptive diagnosis of drowning. If in anybody's autopsy, the highlights that I've given you tonight have not really been found, then it would be up to the medical examiner to sort of take the diagnosis of presumptive drowning and call it that. Or say, I don't see many of these findings. I think it's indeterminate. I am not going to proffer my opinion on the cause of death in Kiely Rodni. I am here to give everybody a systematic way to approach looking at autopsies from a layman's perspective for you all, and for me as from a medical perspective, as a medical professional with my experiences. I hope that my breaking down the terminology, breaking down the systematic way to read different aspects of autopsy, and to also help you to think of freshwater versus saltwater. These are things that I hope will equip you as a true crime member of the true crime community, and as somebody interested in lifelong learning. I hope you feel more equipped with this, what I deem evidence-informed, evidence-based, data-driven, systematic approach to understanding autopsy and to understanding chain of custody, chain of command, importance of communication amongst law enforcement agencies, amongst the medical community and agencies, and very importantly, the resultant transparent, open, cogent, and comprehensive communication style that agencies bring to the table in order to inform the public. Adelante con valentía. Go forward with courage, my friends. And in Italian we say, avanti con coraggio. Buona notte. Buenas noches. Good night.